Support for today's episode comes from Amazon, sharing stories and initiatives focused on protecting water resources and strengthening water resilience in communities around the world. Clean Air Act and RCRA permit drift is building enforcement risk. Clean Air Act and RCRA permit drift is quietly building enforcement. Exposure at industrial facilities. Nobody decides to let a permit fall out of alignment with actual operations. It happens the way most compliance problems happen, incrementally, during busy periods when the paperwork feels less urgent than the work. By the time an inspector shows up, the gap has usually been sitting there for a while, and the penalties for what they find have gone up. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, adjusted its civil penalty maximums in January 2025 to reflect inflation. Penalty exposure under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, varies by provision, but the numbers are significant across the board. Generator violations under RCRA Section 338G can reach $93,058 per day per violation. Certain Subtitle C compliance order violations carry maximums of $124,426 per day. Those figures matter because RCRA violations often compound. A facility that has been storing hazardous waste past the 90-day limit without a permit is not committing one violation. It is committing a violation for each day the unlawful storage continued, each potentially carrying its own penalty. The math gets large quickly. The Clean Air Act, CAA, carries its own per-day civil judicial penalty structure. Under 42 U.S.C. 7413B, CAA civil penalties can reach $124,426 per day of violation, with other CAA provisions carrying different maximums depending on the applicable statutory section. And in practice, when inspectors find one violation, they keep looking. RCRA specialists who work enforcement matters routinely note that inspectors rarely stop at waste. Find a labeling error, and they will audit the Air, Water, and Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act records too. The inspection that starts with one gap frequently ends with a list. What permit drift actually looks like before it becomes an enforcement problem. Permit drift is not a dramatic failure. It is what happens when the permit stays static and the facility does not. A manufacturer adds a production line and does not update its Title V air permit to reflect the new emissions source. A hazardous waste generator changes a process that alters the waste codes it generates and does not update its generator status documentation. A facility installs new equipment that changes its stormwater runoff profile without revising its Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, SWPPP. In each of those cases, the facility is likely operating in good faith. The people running the line are doing their jobs. The EHS team has permits on file. What they do not have is a current permit, one that still describes what the facility is actually doing. That distinction does not matter until an inspector arrives and compares the permit conditions against what they see on the floor. At that point, the good faith explanation helps somewhat in penalty mitigation, but it does not make the violation disappear. Facilities that have not systematically compared current operations against permit conditions in the past 18 to 24 months are the ones most likely to be in this position. The question is not whether the permit was accurate when it was issued, it is whether it is still accurate now. The RCRA violations that show up most consistently in enforcement records. EPA's RCRA enforcement data points to a consistent cluster of violations that appear across industries and facility types. Failure to provide initial or annual refresher training is one of the most common. Incomplete or missing training records are another. Employees signing hazardous waste manifests without the required Department of Transportation hazmat training. Contingency plans that have not been updated after key personnel changes. Containers stored past the allowable limit because a shipment was delayed and the clock kept running. None of those are exotic compliance failures. They are administrative maintenance problems. They happen in facilities with functioning environmental programs because the people running those programs are busy, understaffed, or managing systems that were designed for a smaller operation than the one they are now running. The enforcement data does not care about any of that context. What it reflects is what the inspector found. Personal liability is also a factor the EHS community does not discuss enough. Under RCRA's criminal provisions, corporate officers and EHS managers can face personal fines and imprisonment for knowing violations. The standard is knowingly transporting, treating, or storing hazardous waste in violation of the law. For an EHS manager who is aware of a compliance gap and does not escalate it or address it, that standard is reachable. It rarely gets there. But the legal exposure is real, and it is worth understanding before the situation arises. Clean Air Act Title V permit compliance is a specific and common gap. Title V of the Clean Air Act establishes the Major Source Operating Permit Program that applies to facilities emitting significant quantities of regulated air pollutants. The permit is supposed to be a living document that reflects actual facility operations. In practice, many Title V permits are filed, approved, and then rarely touched until renewal, while the facilities they cover continue to evolve. The gap between a current Title V permit and actual facility operations is one of the more common sources of CAA enforcement exposure at industrial sites. Adding equipment, modifying processes, or changing throughput levels without assessing whether a permit modification is required is the operational pattern that produces violations. Many of those modifications fall below the thresholds that trigger a formal permit revision, but not all of them do. Facilities that rely on informal judgment rather than systematic modification screening are the ones that produce the avoidable violations. EPA's Maximum Achievable Control Technology (MAT) standards, which set emissions limits for specific source categories of hazardous air pollutants, are another consistent source of permit-related exposure. Facilities subject to MACT standards that have not verified their current operations against applicable limits, particularly after equipment changes, are carrying risk they have not formally assessed. MAC compliance failures have driven some of the largest Clean Air Act penalty actions in recent enforcement cycles. Permit maintenance treated as a periodic task rather than an ongoing obligation is the operational pattern that produces them. What a permit alignment review should actually cover. A permit alignment review is not the same as reading the permit. It is a side-by-side comparison of what the permit authorizes and what the facility is currently doing across every regulated activity. That means walking the floor, not just reading files. Emissions sources, waste streams, water discharges, chemical storage, and process configurations all need to be mapped against current permit conditions. Where gaps exist, the question is whether the gap requires a permit modification, a minor deviation report, or an internal correction. The answer depends on the specific permit conditions, the magnitude of the deviation, and the regulatory program involved. That determination needs to happen before an inspector makes it for you. Facilities heading into summer inspection windows that have not done this review in the past 2 years are likely carrying compliance exposure they have not quantified. The inspection data from the past 2 years is consistent about where enforcement actions are forming. Permit gaps are near the top of that list every quarter. Sustainability Soundbites water coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's Spotlight on Water. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.